Hi guys, welcome to the ChooseFI radio podcast. Today we have a very special episode. We're going to be speaking with Jeff, the Happy Philosopher. Several months ago, Brad and I heard Jeff on the Mad Scientist podcast sharing his story, and it blew our minds. And Brad immediately reached out to me and said, we have to bring this guy on the show and hear more. And so it took us a few months to work it out, but finally it's here and we're able to get him on the podcast, and we're excited to share his story with you and really go more into depth about the actual changes Jeff made in his life to pursue happiness.
You're listening to ChooseFI Radio. The blueprint for financial independence lives here. If you're looking to unlock the secrets to financial independence and early retirement, you're in the right place. Stay tuned and join a community of like-minded people who are getting off the hamster wheel and taking control of their lives in the pursuit of financial independence. ChooseFI, your home for financial independence online.
Brad, I'm really excited about this one.
Hey, Jonathan. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. I heard that podcast when Brandon published it a couple months back, and I was instantly drawn into Jeff's story as a medical doctor who got burned out of his job and was trying to find a path forward, both professionally and in his personal life, and trying to find happiness. That so mirrors my own life and the pursuits that I've been following, and trying to find what motivates me, what gets me up in the morning, what are the little things that I find joy in. And it was the last couple minutes of that podcast that just left me wanting more. And yeah, I'm certainly going to touch on some of the precise things that he mentioned, but I instantly emailed him after hearing that podcast and just said, we need you on the show. I want to dive into that exact journey and what you've found, like what makes you tick on a daily basis, what makes you happy, what's working, what's not, and in this whole exploration. So I think this should be a really fascinating conversation. And with that, Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Hey guys, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, we're thrilled to have you, Jeff. I've heard on this show Brad say at least 3 or 4 times, I never dream past here. And the implication being that even when everything is perfect in your life, you can still be susceptible to emptiness. And it illustrates the critical importance of cultivating happiness long before you ever hit this magical number of financial independence. And what really resonated with us about your storyline is that that is the entire focus of your blog. And we're really excited to dig into that content with you. But before we do that, would you just take a couple minutes and kind of introduce your background story for us?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm a physician, and I really didn't think about financial independence early on. So I guess I'll start my story coming out of medical training. So I started my job, and everything in my life was pretty much perfect on paper. I had a great job, great family, great income. Everything was wonderful. But about 4 or 5 years into my career, I found myself completely burned out. I noticed that I just couldn't recharge on my days off. It was really difficult to focus, and I really didn't understand what was happening to me because, again, on paper, my life was perfect. I had the great job with a great income. Life was wonderful, but I just wasn't happy. And about 4 or 5 years in, I realized that something needed to change. I was chronically stressed out and anxious, and I guess my breaking point was I just came home one day and I realized that I couldn't do it anymore. So that's when I sort of dived into this journey of financial independence. I sat down with my wife and I said, I've got about 5 years left in my career, and then I'm going to pull the plug and quit. At that point, I had stumbled upon some early retirement blogs. Early Retirement Extreme was was the first one, and that was mind-blowing, but at the same time, completely unworkable in my mind. It was just a little bit too on the fringe. From Jacob's blog, Early Retirement Extreme, I eventually discovered Pete's blog, Mr. Money Mustache. I'm sure most of your listeners have at least a superficial understanding of what he writes about. And as I dove into it, I realized that I could achieve financial independence in a relatively short amount of time with the income I had as a physician. And that was my decision. I just decided, after 4 or 5 years, I would quit and do something else.
We're highlighting this period of time, this 5-year stint that you're actually working as, I guess you are an attending.
Yeah, I was out of training, about 4 or 5 years out of training as an attending physician.
Okay. And I'm sure that the doctors and physicians that may be listening to this episode automatically get how much time went into that. But for the rest of our audience, your 4 years of undergrad, your 4 years of med school, potentially up to 4 years of residency. So you have minimum 12 years of what I guess you could call sunk cost into obtaining this career. And now you're just a fraction of that period of time into this job, and you can't do it anymore.
Yeah, actually, my residency was 5 years, and I did a 1-year fellowship, so it was even a little bit longer. But you're right; it was a horrible, horrible feeling, because there is this huge sunk cost to becoming a physician, and that was probably the worst part of it, is just realizing that it was not sustainable long term. Yet I had put all of this time and money into my career. Like most physicians, when I came out of training, my net worth was negative or zero because of student loan debt and just the lack of income, significant income up to that point. The biggest revelation was after I made the 5-year decision, the ultimatum, I still realized that I made my prison sentence shorter, but I didn't really make my cell any more comfortable. I still had 5 years left, and I was still completely burned out. So even though I had solved the financial independence portion of this, because the math is relatively easy. I mean, there's all kinds of great articles out there and blog posts that really dive into the technical factors of how much you need to retire and, the 4% rule and variations of that. That's the easy part. The difficult part is, how do you get through the burnout, the job dissatisfaction, and get to that point while being happy? So instead of waiting 5 years and then saying, okay, I'm done, I'm going to be happy now, I really realized that I needed to be happy now, that I couldn't wait 5 years, that there was no point to it. So that was a turning point for me and got me thinking about a lot of different things. And I started experimenting with my life, thinking deeply about happiness and meaning and purpose and how all these things are related to one another. So in many ways, the financial independence part was easy, but the happiness side of the equation was a little bit more complicated. And that's what got me started down this rabbit hole.
So Jeff, there are many people that find themselves in your situation, except maybe 10 years to go before they get to the exact place that you are at this inflection point. And in many cases, that person may find themselves saying to themselves, I am willing to take on any amount of debt. I am willing to do whatever it takes to get this medical degree, even if it's $500,000 in debt. I'm willing to give up the next 12 years of my life because I know that after I do the 4 years of undergrad, after I do the 4 years of med school, after I do the 5 years of residency and the 1 year of fellowship, even if I'm $500,000 of debt, I am going to have the job of my dreams. I am going to finally have this identity that I've been pursuing for the past 4 years. And I am going to have income beyond what I have ever imagined. There's almost this stark contrast between this level of poverty that you experience as a student and then maybe this relatively decent income that you have as a resident, but you're doing that under the confines of 70-hour-a-week job. Finally, you have the income, you have the identity, you have the prestige, and how painful it must be to wake up one morning and realize I'm miserable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and just to take another tangent here, something I've written about a few times in a few articles is physician suicide. I mean, the suicide rate among physicians is actually quite a bit higher than the national average. And I think a lot of that has to do with what you're talking about here, that when physicians burn out and become dissatisfied, it's a terrible feeling, and your ego and your identity are tied up in being a physician. And when you realize that it's maybe not your calling, or it becomes a little bit tedious and you become burned out and realize you can't do it, you really have nothing else to grasp onto.
So Jeff, looking back on your 14 years of medical training and your 4 years of actual full-time work before you reached this breaking point, was there something about the actual job of being a medical doctor that that led you to the breaking point? Or do you think it was that you hadn't cultivated this happiness in your own life and your own brain ultimately? Like what was the ultimate issue now that you've had so much time to explore what you get value out of life?
Yeah, that's a good question and probably a little bit difficult to answer. I think it's probably a combination of both of those factors. That number one, I didn't really realize what ultimately made me happy or how to discover happiness. But at the same time, being a physician is quite stressful. There's this constant chronic stress and worry about making the right decisions. So the chronic stress of being a physician and not really cultivating happiness and going towards things that make me happy, I think contributed to it.
So earlier in this interview, you referred to kind of this path that you were on as a prison sentence. And I know you referenced the fact that you were looking for a way out and you found early retirement extreme, and it blew your mind and opened your ideas to the possibilities, but it sounded like you almost rejected that out of hand. Love to get your thoughts on that.
Right. So when I first stumbled upon early retirement extreme, it was mind blowing. I mean, I'd never really conceptualized this concept of extreme frugality and early retirement, extremely early retirement. But that version of it was so far removed from my life that I really couldn't envision implementing the sort of things that Jacob wrote about, even though intellectually it was just a fascinating blog, and I'm very grateful for him writing it. The prison sentence is a little bit sort of flowery language, but really I think the heart of it is I was trapped, and my life was sort of seemed predetermined. In other words, I really didn't have the freedom to do what I wanted to do. If I wanted to quit my job and go do something else, I really didn't feel free to do that. So that's why I use the analogy of a prison sentence. I felt trapped. And I think a lot of physicians and other high income, long training professionals feel this sunk cost that they put into their career. And they do feel trapped. They feel like they can't leave. They've invested too much into it. It doesn't make sense on a financial or any level to quit their job, to change careers, even if they're mildly to extremely miserable.
It seems to me that, especially with the high income earners, before they're exposed to maybe the stark contrast of an early retirement extreme or a Mr. Money Mustache, when you've bought into this lifestyle inflation that comes with this I deserve it mentality, it's hard to know actually how much money you need before you're able to buy your freedom. I've always found that something that's so fascinating about the FI community is that very quickly we become aware of how much we actually need. And in many cases, the high income earner with the sunk cost just thinks they have to earn forever.
Right. That's absolutely right. You feel like turning off that income stream can be frightening because in some cases it's difficult to get back in and turn it back on. And what I found is that just exploring the FI community and learning about how much you need to be financially independent is liberating, because in some cases you realize that you're not saving enough and that you need a lot more, or you need to cut your expenses. And on the other side of that, sometimes some people stumble into it and realize that they either already are financially independent or that they're much further along in the journey than they thought. In my case, it was the latter. When I started exploring the financial side of things, I realized that I was much further along in my journey than I thought I was. Before I started reading these blogs and examining this area, I figured I needed a lot more money to be financially independent. Just talking to other physicians, I remember one, in retrospect, hilarious conversation I had with the spouse of a doc. And they told me, he said, Happy Philosopher, you need $10 million to retire. And I just kind of, my eyes sort of widened. And I thought, wow, I'm going to be working a long time to save that kind of money. And, that was a couple of years before I went down the rabbit hole of FI. And I realized that was not true. That was way more money than I could ever spend. Well, not really, but based on my current spending, that would be overkill.
So, Jeff, since finding Mr. Money Mustache in the FI community, what changes have you made in your own personal finances? Like, have you done anything to change your lifestyle, or was it already fairly under control, or had you succumbed to that lifestyle inflation that many other doctors might have?
We had a little bit of lifestyle inflation coming out of residency. It was just sort of a natural evolution. As a physician, your financial life is pretty interesting because in medical school, you're in poverty. You have no money. You're borrowing money just to eat and live and pay tuition. And then as a resident, you are living middle class income lifestyle. And then as an attending, the amount of money you make is multiples of what you make in residency, depending on your specialty. So we did increase our lifestyle a bit coming out of training. We bought a bigger house, had to buy furniture and things to put in it. But really, a lot of things did not inflate. So, for instance, we still had the same cars. I drove my car for 16 years before I bought a new one. So we didn't inflate our lifestyles too much, and we really didn't change our spending habits dramatically after learning about financial independence and freedom. I started tracking where the money was going. I hadn't been doing that before, and that allowed us to see where the money was going and direct it towards things that made us happy and were a positive in our life, and allowed us to get rid of things that were not adding value to our life. So although our overall spending amount didn't change significantly, we did change the sorts of things that we were spending money on.
Can you give us some examples of things that you were previously spending money on that you didn't subsequently find value in and you cut?
A lot of the things that we cut were actually little things. So, for instance, we spent a lot of money on cable television that we didn't watch much, and we would buy books instead of going to the library. So we cut out a lot of things like that, which in the overall grand scheme of things didn't really add up to much. So instead of spending money on those sorts of things, we would spend it on other experiences like traveling more, things like that. More experiential things and less material things.
So timeline-wise, you come out of school around the age of 31. You work for this 5-year period of time, and around the age of 36, you say, I'm just burnt out, and I only have about 5 more years that I can do this before I'm going to run out of runway. I have to be out of this job. That's the timeline that we're working with, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So then along this process, you find the FI community, and you start adapting some of these concepts into your life. But what's interesting about this inflection point that I know you made is you had 2 choices once you decided to hit that 5-year runway. The one approach was keep my head down, grind out my prison sentence, and fake satisfaction, disguise misery as satisfaction. That was the one path. And frankly, I know people, especially when the runway is short enough, that make that choice. But that's not the choice you made. And the reason we're having this conversation today is because you made a different choice and it saved your job, right?
Right. After I made the 5-year ultimatum decision to myself, I started exploring other ways that I could extend my career or do my job differently that would decrease the amount of burnout and dissatisfaction. One of the areas that I explored was going part-time, which I'm doing right now. But it took about 3 years to organize that and to make it a reality. And the interesting thing is, in those 3 years, while I was thinking about the possibility of working part-time, I had become happier by the end of those 3 years, even though nothing in my job had really changed. So I was working the same hours, I was doing the same sorts of things, I was taking the same amount of call, but I had emerged from burnout and was more satisfied and happy. It still was not ideal because I really valued the freedom that would come with being financially independent and not having to work, but I had become more satisfied and happy even in spite of changing nothing with my job.
All right. And at this point, you're still full-time, right?
Correct.
So this is really what we want to dig into. We want to find out, what changes did you explicitly make that you found resulted in this increase in happiness?
My path out of burnout was multifactorial and complicated, but I know that it was really a shift in mentality. So realizing that I had more freedom than I did was a big part of it. Exploring gratitude and being more mindful and getting into meditation, optimizing other areas of my life, like, my diet, exercise, all of these little things contributed. It wasn't any one aha moment. Like I just woke up one day and was not burned out. It was work, and it was a process, and it didn't happen overnight.
I'm curious if you could take us back to that breaking point. I always want to dive into like the mindset. So as you said, with many doctors, unfortunately, there's a significant suicide rate, and you could have gone the other way, right? Like you could have spiraled, but you chose the pursuit of happiness. And I'm wondering if you can put us back in your shoes then and talk us through those early days of, you had this breaking point, which is a significant episode in your life, and you chose to get better. Talk us through what that looked like.
Okay. So just to go on a little bit of a tangent here, there's a difference between burnout and depression and becoming suicidal. They are comorbidities. They are related to each other, but they're different. So even though I was pretty burned out and emotionally sort of exhausted, I wasn't really depressed in the clinical sense of the term. I wasn't suicidal. And there were a lot of things going on that contributed to the anxiety and the burnout. And some of those things were not related to my job. I'll give you an example. So at that point in my life, I read a lot of news. I was sort of tied up in the doom and gloom kind of category of blogging and reading. So I would read about things like peak oil, and this was all happening right around the financial collapse of 2009. And I was paying attention to all these things, and they were compounding the stresses in my life. And I was focusing on things that I had no control. You have no control over the stock market or economic systems or politics or things like that. So cutting out all of the external stressful things that I was latching onto, I think was a big part of emerging from burnout.
And Jeff, in one of your articles, I was definitely taken by the fact that you have cut out news. It sounds like you've cut out television as well. I know in my own life, I have to a large degree cut out news. And I was someone who was always into reading up on politics and reading up on world news. And I came to the same conclusion that you did, which is I can't control it. And it's just going to, as you said, amplify fear and anger. That's a quote from one of your articles. And I found that nothing good happened when I followed this stuff. It was just doom and gloom all the time, and there was nothing I could do about it. So I know a direct parallel in my own life with that. Another thing I used to be passionate about that I've cut out is following sports to a large degree. Like I used to put like my heart and soul into, quote, my teams. And now since I've moved away from New York and all the home teams, I just don't care anymore. And I think back to the time when I used to just devote so much time and energy into these teams that they weren't my team. It was just a jersey. And it's just so fascinating when I have my family come down and visit, like they're sitting watching sports all the time, and I've just moved on and I just don't care anymore. And I'm curious if you have cut out anything other than news in your life as far as inputs like sports or anything like that.
It's interesting that you mentioned sports, because I found that over the years through this journey, I mirror what you're saying. I have become less interested in following a certain team. I still enjoy sports just from the athletic standpoint, from sort of the beauty of the art of a sport. But all of these things, news, sports rivalries, they're all designed to be, well, let's go back to news. A lot of people think that the purpose of news is to inform us, to educate us, but it's really not. The purpose of news is to get us to watch more news and to make us feel like we're missing out on something if we're not constantly following the news. You watch these 24-hour news programs and it's breaking news and it makes you feel like it's all important, but it's really 99.9% of it is not important, doesn't matter to your life. It's not actionable. Knowing about it and being stressed out about it doesn't add any value to your life. So I encourage people that watch a lot of television, watch a lot of news, to cut it out of their life for 30 days and just see what happens. I don't ask people to give up something forever, but I'm a big fan of doing experiments and experimenting with cutting things out of your life that are potentially harmful or not adding value is a big part of growing and discovering happiness. And I found that news is one of the bigger causes of stress and anxiety in many people's lives.
You know, we haven't really hit on this concept too many times, but I'd love to get your take on it. That essentially sounds like a form of stoicism, and it sounds like this concept of happiness through subtraction.
Yeah, I love that concept. I think Mad Fientist wrote an article along those lines that's great. And maybe even I wrote an article about this. I can't remember. I think I did. It sounds familiar. Most of the time we try to add things to our lives that we think will make us happier. So this is the essence of the treadmill, the consumerism. We think that adding more things to our lives will make us happier. But really, what will probably make us happier is getting rid of all the negative things in our lives. That's the first thing that we should do. We should get rid of the negatives, just eliminate them, and then see what's left. And a lot of times the positive things in our life are right in front of us, but we don't realize them because there's all these negative things and negative influences running around distracting us. So I wrote an article. The title of it was Alligators and Kittens, kind of a ridiculous title. But the way I frame it is that the good things in your life are kittens and the bad things in your life are alligators. And if you have alligators and kittens running around your house, what would you do first? Would you add more kittens? Probably not. You would get rid of the alligators because alligators are way more destructive and negative than kittens are positive. So getting rid of the bad things in your life is what we should focus on first, and then add good things later after we've gotten rid of all the negatives.
Jeff, that's interesting because I'm currently reading a book called 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do. And it's by an author named Amy Morin. And I heard her on a podcast recently. And she is echoing a lot of what you're saying, which is it's not always about what you do in your life to make it successful or to make yourself mentally strong or whatever it may be. It's paring back these negative things that are holding you back because they are so much more destructive.
Jeff, I love that you highlighted this idea of decluttering because that's something that I know you've written about. I loved your article, Decluttering Philosopher Ninja Style. And my favorite sentence in this entire article is, it's kind of like what I would imagine if Martha Stewart ran Fight Club. Radical, countercultural, and very, very polite. It is a beautiful, well-mannered kick to the groin of consumerism.
Yeah, I love that.
I wonder who wrote it.
Yeah, decluttering is a huge thing. And that ties into this whole getting rid of the negatives in your life. But there's multiple forms of decluttering. When we think of decluttering, we tend to focus on the physical things in our lives. And I think that's a good place to start. So that article that I wrote that after reading the Marie Kondo book.
That's called the life-changing magic of tidying up, right?
Yeah. It's a great book, and it's a sort of a paradigm shift. So that was a book that when I read that book, shifted in my mind what the purpose of material things were. And the essence is they're here to bring us joy. And if they're not bringing us joy, we need to get rid of them. But in addition to that, there are so many other things in our lives that we can declutter. For instance, your email inbox, your friends, the front screen of your iPhone, your commitments. All of these things are worth taking a hard look at and eliminating or letting go of the things that don't add any value or add negative value to your life. So I love the concept of decluttering, but taking it beyond just the physical, I think, will make a big difference in a lot of people's lives. Another example of this would be at work. Many times there are commitments and things that we worry about in our jobs that really aren't necessary. So if we can get rid of those negative things in our careers, in our jobs, a lot of times the positive things in our career or job can emerge.
What I love about the article that you wrote was this line, and it refers back to intentionality, which in many cases seems like almost this source that a lot of this information flows downstream from. But it says, if we are not intentional about our lives, clutter will fill it. Nature abhors a vacuum.
Yeah, I mean, we all intuitively know this to be true. So when you clean your house and declutter, if you're not intentional and mindful about things coming in, the space will be filled. I mean, it happens in my house. Somehow I get rid of a lot of stuff, and in the next few months, it fills again. It's just nature, entropy, disorder, chaos. So we have to be intentional about things that we bring into our lives, because if we're not, they will just somehow appear. They will appear on our calendar, on our schedule, in our house, and we won't necessarily know where they came from.
Jeff, that's a very powerful item there at the end. I find that my calendar now fills up, and sometimes I don't even know how it happened. I'll take a coffee meeting or a lunch meeting or, this or that. And by the time I'm done looking at my week, I have so few hours left to myself to do something productive or do something that I actually am going to thoroughly enjoy, or even just time to sit and reflect or read a book or anything. And it's like the tyranny of the schedule. And I think because I'm not applying that intentionality to it, it's just becoming overwhelming. So I'm curious if you found that in your life, as far as I have a hard time saying no, I guess. And have you been more intentional with your time as well as these items? So
I have been more intentional with my time, and I wrote an article on power of saying no. This is actually a life hack, if you will, that is extremely useful. If you don't know how to say no, commitments will fill your schedule. You have to be willing and able and good at saying no to things that don't add value to your life, like those coffee meetings or obligations that just somehow slip into the calendar. So learning to say no is in some ways a superpower. It will open up so much time in our lives.
What I think is so interesting about that statement is that while it sounds very simple at face value to say no, it's not just whether or not you're saying no. There's also an art form to saying no. Have you ever noticed that someone rejects you and you don't even realize it, whereas someone else does it and you take it as this great offense that wounds you to your soul? And in many cases, the difference is their approach or their skill. And I think that is worth focusing and highlighting.
Absolutely. I think that you can say no in a way that is polite and makes the person feel good about it. You don't say no just to say no and be mean, but by saying no, you're really saying yes to the value of your own time. Every time you say yes to something else, you are giving up a part of your freedom and your time for that. So by flipping it around that way and framing it that way, I think it can be easier to say no. It's really just having respect for your time.
So you are 31 years old and you wake up one morning and you realize, I just can't do this anymore. And you talk to your wife and you say, I'm burnt out. She kind of gives you her tacit approval for you to come up with this 5-year runway where at the end of 5 years, you just tell her, I don't think I can make it anymore. And I'm curious, what did that 5-year process actually look like for you? And it's my understanding that you are currently working, so something must have shifted, right?
Right. So I think the most interesting part of my journey is that at the 3-year mark, or a little bit before that, it looked like it just wasn't going to work out, that part-time was not going to be an option. It was too complicated. And at that 3-year point or 2.5-year point, I had accepted that I may just keep working full-time. And interestingly enough, I was pretty happy at that point. So I made changes to my life in other areas without changing a single thing in my job. Yet I was happier. At 3 years, I did end up going part-time, and that was a really great thing. It was good for me, but I still was happy at that point, even if I needed to keep working full-time.
So I think there's probably a lot of doctors that would that are listening to this that would maybe like some more details on what part-time actually looks like for you as a radiologist, how were you able to land that or set that up?
So there are a lot of ways to work part-time as a physician. And the way I do it is a job share. So I share a full-time position with another radiologist. We are one full-time equivalent in the system. There are a lot of other ways that physicians can work part-time. They can just work part-time if their group decides that they don't need a full-time position, if they're overstaffed, for instance, or if they want to have 4.5 full-time equivalents instead of 4 or 5. One can work locums, which is a temporary job. Typically, groups that have somebody out on leave or they're short-staffed will want somebody to fill in temporarily. So that is an option. I'm sure there are other creative ways that I'm not thinking of right now. But in my profession, in radiology, I think part-time is a little bit easier to arrange, because radiology is more of a shift work sort of profession, whereas some of the primary care professions or specialties, the patients expect to see their doctor. So it's a little bit more complicated for part-time positions.
So in many cases, and often this is the economic situation of going $500,000 in debt to get a degree, but medical students will pick a specialty based on an expected rate of return or that higher salary. But the decision you've made to go part-time obviously is going to come with a reduction in salary. And it strikes me that you sound like you are happier for having made that choice, but that would to some degree seem to defy logic based on maybe the normal equation that people use.
Yeah, I completely agree. The decision I made to go part-time economically on paper was a horrible decision, because the biggest asset that a physician has typically, especially in their 30s, 40s, is their ability to work and their ability to work full time. And that's their biggest asset. So turning off half of that income stream at a relatively early age is not financially a smart decision. From a pure financial, write it down on a spreadsheet decision. But ultimately, the goal in life is not to accumulate the largest pile of money. The goal in life is happiness and contentment and satisfaction. So if working part-time or changing careers or changing jobs within a career, if that is what is going to make one happy, then that's the right decision.
Yeah, I love that, Jeff. And that's what we somewhat affectionately know as FU money. While you might not say FU to the job, you can pick and choose aspects that you like about the job, or in your case, pick to only work a portion of the time. So I think that's what we're constantly talking about here, where when you are accumulating this power in your corner by saving money, you can make these decisions from a position of strength, as opposed to, oh no, my world is going to crumble if I don't have my full paycheck for 30 days, right? Like so many people who are living truly paycheck to paycheck. So yeah, I completely appreciate that.
Jeff, in light of the logical statement that we just talked about, the physician during this window from 30 to 40, maybe 30 to 45, this could be their peak earning years. And you've made the decision to go part-time. And while I think at face value that could seem illogical, in light of this article you wrote talking about the marginal utility of money, I think it makes perfect sense to me and probably also to Brad. But I'd love to hear you break down this concept of the marginal utility of money.
Sure. So I wrote this article, How Understanding the Marginal Utility of Money Will Make You Happier. And it's really expanding upon some of the concepts that were in the book, Your Money or Your Life. I'm sure a lot of your listeners have read that book. It's a great book. But the whole idea of that book and this article is that there's a curve of money and happiness, and it's not linear. The first money you spend in your life is going to bring the most happiness. And the last amount of money, the last dollar you spend, is probably not going to bring as much incremental happiness. So the more money we spend, we may become happier in some ways, but at some point that curve levels off, and it requires a lot of money to really bring small amounts of happiness. And if you think about money in being fungible with time. So money and time being the same thing for somebody who earns X amount of dollars per hour. So the more they work, the more money they make. Really, money and time are the same thing. So you're spending money on happiness, but you're also spending your time on happiness. And since time is not infinite, it really is one of the few commodities that we have that is not potentially infinite. We all have a defined, more or less, lifespan on average. As we age, our time becomes more valuable in some ways because we have less of it. So we're trading time for money, and then we're using money to buy happiness. Yet at the same time, our time is becoming more rare. And the more we spend, the less happiness we obtain. It's a little bit confusing, and I drew some graphs with my very high artistic skills on that blog post.
I'm a huge fan of your graphs. But I will say, I think that if you're having trouble with that concept, it helps to go to the end of your fraction of time. It goes to that concept of scarcity. It goes to those moments approaching your death. And if you think about, and this is kind of morbid, but I know you wrote about it. If you think about that last year before you pass away, how much value does money have to you at that point? Every single second that ticks on the clock, money becomes significantly less valuable. And you would give away all of your money in order to go back and reclaim more of your time.
Right, exactly. It's an easy concept to grasp once you see the pictures, but it's really hard to implement. It's surprisingly hard to take that and apply it to your life for a lot of people. But just having that realization, you realize that when we trade our time for money, there's no right or wrong answer. It's a dilemma. It's a trade-off. So when we trade it isn't inherently good or bad. It's just a choice that we make. And it has consequences. And the further we go into that trade, the further along in life we go, the more risky it becomes if we're not happy, because we're gambling with less time that we have left. So if we're mindful of that, I think it forces our hand to try to be happier earlier in our life and not wait, because you never know. You never know when things are going to take a turn, either health problems or ultimately death.
You know, what I think is so powerful about that concept is that the obvious way to get the best of both worlds would be to trade your time for money doing something that brings you happiness, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that is the holy grail, so to speak, of a career. If you can find something that you love to do, and as a byproduct, you get money for it, you get paid for it, that's great, because it's free. If you love something and you're getting paid for it, it's free. It's free time. You would have done it anyways.
And to me, that's why, Brad always says financial independence is like a superpower. And we've been so intentional about separating the FI from the early retirement piece of this, because FI gives you the freedom to fail. And if you define it that way, you can potentially build this construct in which you're working and you may earn money, but those two don't have to be related to each other. Instead, you have that freedom to fail, which then allows you to do something that you love.
And Jonathan, not just the freedom to fail, but the freedom to explore. And I think that's what Jeff is talking about here with this pursuit of happiness, that because you had the financial side of things down pat, you can take a step back and look at your life holistically and say, what do I get value out of? What do I enjoy? What would make me happier? What can I progress towards that are going to bring me some value in the future? Like, all these things are really, really important. And Jeff, real quick, obviously we're talking about the marginal utility of money, and there is this point of diminishing returns where additional dollars just aren't as valuable. And I'm curious, how you thought through that in your own life. Did you sit down with a budget and say, these are the items I get value from, and here's the savings I need to hit my FI number in X number of years? Were you that intentional about it? Or talk me through that process of how you determined what brought you value in your life.
The way I approach it is on a case-by-case basis. So it's not something where I sit down and go through spreadsheets, and it's just every spending decision, I make this subconscious mental calculation in my mind. Is it worth it to me? It's the your money or your life concept. Is this purchase worth 1 hour, 2 hour, 5 days of my time? at my job. That's how I approach it. I love that concept, and that's how I tie it in with the marginal utility of money.
That's great. And if I could introduce a new phrase to you, what I call that is I'm a valueist. I'm not frugal. I'm not cheap. It's I determine what I value in life. And it sounds like you are extraordinarily similar in this regard. And if that, again, hits that, like you said, a subconscious decision for what makes sense, then that's something that I deem of value and I purchase it. Like I don't second guess or hem and haw. It's like a 0 or 1, essentially. Like I determine, does this make sense based on the price? Do I value it? Does it make sense based on the time that I have to allocate? Those type of considerations. And if so, then it's a go. And if not, I'm never going to second guess it because I didn't value it.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's the distinction really between frugality and cheapness. Just being cheap and saving money for the sake of it isn't really going to add value to your life. So most of my decisions right now, my purchasing decisions are based on value and happiness rather than cost, for instance. So I like that term, valuist.
Yeah, it's a good one. And I'm curious, what have you spent money on that does bring you happiness? I know that you just alluded to that. Like, what have you added to your life? So we talked about subtraction, but are there items that you've added that have had a demonstrable impact on your happiness positively?
It's surprising when I look at at what I spend money on. I really don't buy a lot of material things. Most of the things that bring us happiness are experiences. So, having a really expensive car, a closet full of designer clothes, those things really don't bring me any happiness. So we don't buy them. But I'll give you an example of an area that like I recently just purchased a new guitar, and this is actually a pretty good example of frugality versus cheapness. So I had this old guitar for years, and it wasn't a very good guitar. I bought it in college. In college, I was spending all my money on rent and beer, so there wasn't a whole lot of guitar money. But it was an okay guitar, and I've been playing this for years, always meaning to upgrade to a nicer guitar. And recently, I finally got a pretty nice guitar. And looking back at it, I realized that was a great way to spend my money, because guitar is something I love to do. Not great at it, but I was being cheap. I didn't want to spend the money on a nice guitar. And when I did, I realized that I probably should have bought one years ago, because it brings me a lot of joy to play that nicer guitar.
Jeff, you've really focused on this idea of utility and happiness are different concepts, and they often get confused when you're not looking at it rationally, right?
Right, exactly. So a good example of this that I wrote about would be a fork. So all forks are pretty much the same. There's not like a new fork technology that allows you to eat more comfortably or better. I don't know, maybe there is. But the cost distribution of forks is immense, from almost free, like a garage sale fork, that you get for 5 cents, to the finest sterling silver engraved fork that could cost hundreds of dollars. The $100 fork isn't necessarily going to bring you any more happiness than the garage sale fork or fork from Target, for instance. Realizing where that utility levels off. So at some point, some item is going to fulfill the utility that you need it to do. And you can upgrade it, you can spend more money on it, but it isn't necessarily going to bring you any more happiness. You owe it to yourself on bigger purchases, bigger spending decisions, to really analyze the utility and happiness that something's going to get you. A car is a perfect example. You can spend anywhere from a couple $100 to 6 figures on a car, and at some point you're going to fulfill the utility that you need, and you don't need to spend any more. You're just buying maybe a little bit of comfort, and you have to ask yourself, is that going to bring me more happiness? Is it worth my time? Is it worth trading my time for the money to bring a tiny amount more of comfort?
Jeff, that's so interesting, because that's how I approach my purchasing decisions as well. I'm sitting here with this huge smile on my face as you're going through it, because it's so reminiscent of my own life. And it's funny, I just was in a sporting goods store a couple of days ago, actually. My daughter, Molly, and I, one of our experiences, and this is kind of a free thing we do, is we love walking through a sporting goods store and trying out some of the equipment and just kind of having this fun little adventure together. And it's completely free. But what we actually saw was treadmills. Okay, so this one brand had 3 different treadmills right next to each other. One was $900, one was $1,500, and one was $1,900. And for the life of me, I stood there for 10 minutes trying to figure out what the differences were between these treadmills, and I couldn't find them. And I was thinking precisely, like, what is the marginal utility of spending this extra $1,000? And ultimately, the only difference was the size of the TV screen that they had on this dopey treadmill. I kid you not. It was insane. I tried to figure out if there was anything else, but it's almost like people derive satisfaction by spending more money sometimes. Like, oh, I got the best, so therefore it's great, right? And it's almost like justifying this weird decision. And like, you're not getting any extra value out of that. Like, sure, I would never buy a treadmill, but I could understand someone buying a treadmill. That $900 one is going to operate the exact same as the $1,900 one. And you have $1,000 more in your bank account. It's amazing how many different decisions are like that. And I think that's really valuable that you pointed that out to the audience about this marginal utility. It's find what the value is in each purchase and don't spend any more on bells and whistles or a designer name brand or something like that. Like, that's just the noise. Like, cut through and figure out like what actually matters.
So just to add to that, the problem with just buying something that's better is that you're going to adapt to it. We all do. We're human. Our minds more or less work the same. So an example in my life is when I bought my car. I even wrote a post on this, on when I bought my new car. My 16-year-old residency car was just not cutting it anymore. But when I first started driving that car, I mean, it was amazing. I felt like I was in a spaceship. It had features that were not even invented when I bought my original car. And the first few weeks I drove it, it was amazing. Maybe even the first few months. But now I'm used to it. And that's my baseline. And I'm not really any happier driving that car anymore. So just buying something that's better isn't necessarily going to make us happier in the long run. We have to be really mindful that when we're just buying new things, we get that little burst of neurotransmitters that make us feel good, almost like a drug, but it's not going to last. So unless we have excess money in our life, or we have, we're trading our time for money in a way that brings us joy, we really have to be careful of that, or we'll be working forever in a job that we're not necessarily 100% happy in.
Well, Jeff, thank you just generally for being willing to share so much of what you've struggled with, what this journey has actually looked like. I mean, we talked about this idea of burnout. We talked about decluttering. We focused on what the pursuit of happiness, practically what it actually looked like for you. And I think that's going to be very valuable for our audience, for people that see the danger of that burnout in their near future and people that are already experiencing it and are trying to recover from it. What I think is so cool about your story is that, you had this 5-year runway, which you told your wife, I'm going to have to get out. And now it's 5 years past that point. And not only are you still in this particular job that at one point felt like a prison sentence, but you're thriving? And I'd be curious, what final tips or takeaways could you pass along to our audience?
Probably the biggest thing is just having gratitude. I wrote a post over on 1,500 days. Do you guys?
Yes, we did. We're big fans of Carl and Mindy.
Yeah, I am too. I love his blog. But I wrote a guest post over there called "How to Be the Happiest Person in the Room." And it really focuses on gratitude. And I think internalizing gratitude and making that a part of your daily practice, if we haven't touched on that already, is really one of the bigger meta life hacks. My whole message is that we should be focusing on happiness. And once we achieve that, really everything else can fall in place in our lives. And the big thing that I learned throughout this journey is that happiness is a skill. It doesn't just emerge in some of us. We have to practice at it. So if we're not happy, we need to take the steps to learn how to be happy. We need to implement the tools to create happiness. And what I've found through my journey is that gratitude is the foundation of my happiness. It's really a meta skill like no other. Be relentless with gratitude and your life will change.
Yeah, Jeff, that's extremely powerful. And I'm curious, like on a granular level, like what does a gratitude practice look like in your life? Like how overt are you about it? Like, do you write things down in the morning? Do you write them down in the evening? Is it just more, like you said, like that meta skill that you're just constantly cognizant of it? Or what does this look like practically?
So in my life, it's a very informal practice. It's a lot like meditation. So when I find myself feeling sorry for myself or feeling bad about something, some situation in my life, and I catch myself, I always try to stop, take a breath, and reframe it in a way that expresses gratitude. So, if I'm having a bad day at work, and it's stressful or I'm in pain, I always try to reframe it and think of the things that are going positive, that are positive in my life, and focus on the things that I'm grateful for. And by reframing that, the negative things are less negative. They don't have the same impact. I realize that a lot of the things that I think are negative are really not important. They're not that big of a deal. I make more of them than they are.
Yeah, that's so crucial. And I hope everyone goes back and listens to that and really takes that in, because so many people, when you just go through your life, so many people are just complaining and griping about little grievances, and they don't understand why they're unhappy or why their lives aren't working out the way they wanted to, or why they can't get out of a situation. Like they're just constantly harping on the negative. And I love that mental reframing. And I think it's so important. So yeah, I really wanted to take a minute to emphasize that. So yeah, thank you very much, Jeff.
You bet. The reason that a lot of us are unhappy is that we are not designed to be happy. Our brains are not, that is not their primary goal to make us happy. The primary goal of our brain is survival. And historically, we have survived by being vigilant and stressed out all the time. And those threats are largely no longer there, but we still have that wiring in place. We still have this inherent anxiety all the time. And if we can just realize that and interrupt that process continuously until it becomes a habit, that will make us happier.
Yeah, and that's the space between stimulus and response that we're constantly talking about here on the podcast. If you just interrupt that, like you said, and just find that space, you can choose to respond differently. And I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that is the essence of mindfulness and meditation is to interrupt that stimulus and make a conscious decision whether you're going to act upon it, whether you're going to allow yourself to become worked up.
All right, Jeff. Now, have you heard our hot seat yet?
I have listened to your podcast several times, so I knew this was coming.
Nice.
In a world drowning in debt and rampant consumption, trapped by the chains of lifestyle inflation, these questions highlight the secrets of those who have broken free. Welcome to the ChooseFI Hot Seat.
Wow. Did you guys hire Jim Collins to be the voiceover for that?
Wouldn't that have been awesome? Maybe that's for next year.
I bet he'd do it.
Maybe we could get him to do a Christmas special.
Nice. I like it.
Nice. All right, Jeff. Question number 1, your favorite blog that's not your own.
My favorite blog. I don't read blogs as much as I used to, but I think I'm going to have to be really generic here and go back to Pete's blog, Mr. Money Mustache, because I think that is just, there's so much good information on that blog, and the framing and the way he frames and approaches life is, I think, beneficial to a lot of people, myself included. I got a lot of value out of his blog, especially early on when I discovered it, going through Burnout.
All right. Question number 2, your favorite article of all time. Now, we encourage you, this can either be one that you wrote or somebody else's.
Favorite article of all time. There's so many good ones and so many that I've probably forgotten about. But I'm gonna go a little bit different here. So there's a blog called Wait But Why. Have you stumbled upon that one?
Yes, we've actually, a couple of our guests have mentioned articles from Wait by Why. So that's interesting. I'm curious to hear where you're going with this.
It's a great blog, and all of his articles are very thought-provoking. But since I haven't really bashed on social media yet, which is something that everybody should be very mindful of and probably cut out of their lives, there's an article called 7 Ways to Be Insufferable on Facebook. I recommend that one.
Nice. I like the sound of that. We will definitely link up everything you've mentioned, all your articles and these ones as well in the show notes, so everybody can check them out there.
Excellent. And if I have to throw one of my articles in there, I think the How to Be the Happiest Person in the Room article is one that I love, even though it's not on my blog. I like that one. It sums up a lot of my thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great one, and we'll definitely link to that as well. Question number 3, your favorite life hack.
So we've talked about a lot of life hacks in the episode. So I'm gonna go. This isn't necessarily my favorite life hack, but it may be something that's a little bit non-intuitive. And I wrote an article about this. And I think that for people that are habitual drinkers, going on an alcohol fast for 6 months or more, it is extremely liberating and educational, and will allow people that drink regularly to realize the potential negative effect of alcohol on their lives.
So Jeff, when you say habitual drinkers, like let's say my wife and I have like a beer or a glass of wine, literally one every night, like would that be a habitual drinker, and like we would benefit from cutting this out? Or are you talking about like people who are like drinking to get drunk, or that kind of thing?
I think both. I think everybody who consumes alcohol on a regular basis, it's worth doing the experiment to see how it affects your body, how it affects your emotional state, and more interestingly, the subtle effects of alcohol on society. It allows you to step outside of the habit of alcohol and see it in a way that you may not have appreciated as somebody who drinks regularly. Not necessarily just raging alcoholics, but people that couple drinks a night.
Right, and that certainly ties back to the happiness through subtraction that you've talked about previously in the episode. So Jeff, what kind of time period are we talking about here? Is this like something you could do over 30 days? Is it something longer? Like what would you actually get benefit from?
Yeah, the time period is important, actually, because I've done 30-day alcohol fasts, and you don't get to a place of self-reflection in 30 days. 30 days is easy. 6 months is hard because you're going to be exposed to a lot of social situations that you may feel like you need to drink to fit in, and you can't really avoid those in a 6-month period. In a 30-day period, it's easy. You just avoid the triggers, and but it's not as interesting. I'll leave it at that.
That makes perfect sense, and right, you obviously cannot avoid triggers for half a year. So I am very impressed by that. All right, Jeff. Question number 4: your biggest financial mistake.
Well, my biggest financial mistake was also probably my best decision. And we talked about this. Financially, my biggest quotes mistake was going part-time. That cost me the most financially. But ultimately, as we talked about, it was a great decision for me.
What I love about what you just said, Jeff, and we've said this on the show before, we talk about this idea that it's just math. And so, do what the math tells you. But then this idea that just because something's optimal doesn't mean it's the right choice for your life. And once you tie in this other concept of the marginal utility of money, you made the right choice for your life. And it can be it's amazing that can be your biggest financial mistake. And at the same time, it can be the best choice you ever made.
Yeah, exactly. I like the way you framed that. Yeah, I mean, I can look back and point to investments, where I lost a lot of money, thousands of dollars, but they're nothing compared to the opportunity cost of giving up half of my income.
All right, Jeff, question number 5, the advice you would give your younger self.
These are always just horrible. I hate these questions. The advice I would give my younger self. These actually are extremely difficult questions to answer because all of the decisions I made in my life got me to where I am right now. So if I were to change something, I may not be where I am now. All of the struggles in my life have sort of got me to this point. So eliminating those struggles I may be a different person. I may not be as happy as I am. But I think two things that kind of pop into my head are number one, learn to be present. And that's something that's a skill that I'm still working on. But especially earlier in my life, I had trouble with this. I would live in the future worrying about it, or reminisce about the past and have regrets. So just learning to be present, I think, is the advice I would give myself.
All right, and we do have a bonus question for you. Your favorite purchase made on Amazon this year?
Yeah, I knew this question was coming, and I actually went through my Amazon purchase, and it's all just a bunch of crap. It's like oil filters and iPad cases and a book that I was like 28th on the whole list at the library that I didn't want to wait 6 months to read. So nothing life-changing on Amazon. But I think the best purchase I made this year that stands out is the new guitar, and we talked about that. The upgraded guitar, definitely.
I was actually kind of interested to ask you this question, not because I had any idea what you were going to answer, but because I was pretty sure it wasn't going to be a TV. And the reason I say that is you had this really fun article talking about this idea of kill your television and how much you despise not just 24-hour news, but TV in general. And what was so hilarious about it is down at the bottom of that article, you had this picture of this landfill just full to the brim of just old and abused and used televisions, cracked screens and everything. And then down right below that, I think you had an affiliate link for a television on Amazon. And it says, if you click this Amazon link and buy a television, I will hang my head in shame and promptly donate any commission I receive to some worthy cause to try and counterbalance the levels of ridiculousness in the universe. Namaste.
I don't think anybody bought a television. Thank goodness.
Thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been a lot of fun. And before we let you go, what's the best way for people to connect with you?
My blog, thehappyphilosopher.com, and all of my contact information and evil social media can be found on that site. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, and there's a contact page if somebody wants to send me a message.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
Awesome. Hey, this is a lot of fun.
Yeah, man, we had a blast. And to our audience, thank you for being a part of the ChooseFI community. If you want to support us, here are 4 easy ways. 1, leave us an iTunes review. If you want to do that, just go to ChooseFI.com/iTunes. 2, use our page to sign up for travel credit cards. If you want to travel the world with miles and points instead of your hard-earned dollars, then just go to ChooseFI.com/cards and get started today. 3, if you're working on the milestones of FI, set up a personal capital account to track your progress and use our affiliate link. It's completely free, and just go to ChooseFI.com/PC. P as in Paul, C as in cat. And 4, and most importantly, find your friends, coworkers, and family members who might be open to this message and tell them about the podcast. Have them start with episode 38, The Why of FI, and right behind that, have them go listen to episode 21, The Pillars of FI. It is a fantastic starting place. All right, my friends, the fire is spreading. We'll see you next time as we continue to go down the road less traveled.
You've been listening to ChooseFI Radio Podcast, where we help middle-class America build wealth, one life hack at a time.